Paul O'Connor with presentation titled Technocratic Tricksterism, Experts' Knowledge Generation and the Self-Legitimation of the Administrative State. Please, Paul.
Thank you, Marius. I hope everyone can hear. I'll try and share the screen here. Okay, so hopefully everything is visible. Yes. So what my presentation is about really is taking the background of the pandemic and thinking through that about the power of expertise as a form of knowledge, as experts, as individuals, and their role in contemporary society. And to start with, I think we can look at the pandemic as two different kinds of things. On the one hand, we have a biological phenomenon, and that is not unprecedented. There have been many pandemics and many epidemics in human history, some of them more lethal, more virulent than COVID-19. And then we have the socio-political phenomenon of lockdowns, quarantines, massive international travel restrictions, and so on. And in many ways, that is unprecedented. So Chris made reference earlier to, I think, 86% of people around the globe at one point being under lockdown. Well, it's not just in terms of extent. You've situations where funerals have been prohibited or limited to 5 or 10 people, where people haven't been allowed to say goodbye to their relatives as they died, where new fathers were not allowed to be with their wives or partners as they gave birth, where here in the United Arab Emirates, the mosques were shut down. In Ireland, the masses were suspended for many months. So even things that were seen as the most sacred aspects of human life had to be suspended for this pandemic. And that I think is unprecedented. And what is behind this? When, as I say, we've had other epidemics and pandemics before. And partly it is what Yanis referred to, this virtual online reality that has emerged over the last 2 decades and has reached maturation just before the pandemic started, that life could be shifted to a certain degree online. But it is also about the role of experts, and these restrictions and suspensions of ordinary life have been legitimated and mandated by these people who suddenly appeared on our TV screens, who we, in most cases, had never heard of before, but who are experts who suddenly took the guiding hand across entire societies. So what I want to do, it's not to critique any particular government measure or policy. It's rather to look at this phenomenon of expertise that has come to fascinate me in the course of the last 12 months or more. What is it as a form of knowledge? What is it as a peculiarly modern form of power? And what does it say about those things? And the phrase up here on the screen, I'm sure everyone has heard in different languages 1 million times now. Follow the science. A similar phrase, decisions need to be data-led or based on the data. Listen to the experts. This discourse is all around us for the past year. Now, interestingly, it's not just during COVID-19, even though it's taken over everywhere during COVID. So if we look back to the 12 months, 2 years before the pandemic, the big news story at that point was Greta Thunberg and the school climate strikes. And anytime Greta Thunberg would be asked in an interview, what are you calling on governments to do? What do the strikers want governments to do? Her answer, her catchphrase, listen to the scientists. And from a different side of the political spectrum, if we turn back to the financial crisis just over a decade ago, we saw technocratic governments being imposed in places like Greece, Italy, the Troika coming into Ireland. Before that, again, there's been this ongoing movements to make central banks independent of governments. So what we have is this dichotomy where the decisions based on politics are immediately seen as in some way faulty, ignorant, skewed towards short-term electoral considerations. And the answer is the power of hand decisions over to experts who are neutral and well informed, and these people can make correct decisions in the interests of society as a whole. Now, should we take this at face value, this discourse of the prioritization of expertise over politics? Certainly not. First of all, science is always contested. So you get a bunch of different experts, they recommend different things. We've seen this throughout the pandemic. The Great Barrington Declaration, differential advice at the start of the pandemic about masks, the ongoing issues of which vaccines are safe, should they all be given to the elderly, to young people? Different experts will always give different opinions. Likewise, decisions should be made on the data. Well, data isn't just something given that's neutral and incontestable. Data is constructed, again, through political processes. And anybody who has done research or is familiar with how research works knows that things like the choice of research question, methods, analysis, all shape the results. And then how those are presented, whether it be in an academic paper or picking the kind of interesting highlight for a press release or a media interview. All these things, again, are political. Knowledge needs also to be assembled to translate it into decisions. Very rarely is there one scientist or expert or whoever can give the answer in terms of public policy. It needs to be pulled together from different sources. This means filtering it through processes and organizations. And experts obviously are neutral, they have their own professional interests and so on. And if you contract out decision-making to those with expertise in one specific area, the decisions are going to reflect their particular priorities. So if you contract decision-making to public health experts, other social interests like education or civil liberties or the economy are going to be subordinated to public health. If you contract decision-making to economists, balancing the budget is going to take precedence over everything else. So, politics, rather than being seen as the problem, if it was working right, it should balance the different interests of society as a whole and of its component parts. So, this discourse that has become dominant, particularly in the last 12 months, we can't take it on face value. So the questions that have been kind of playing in my mind is, first of all, expertise as a technique of power. And I suppose I should clarify that when I'm talking about experts in this context, I'm not really talking about the scientist up in Greenland who's driving, looking at cores in the Greenland ice, or the person in a lab who's producing a vaccine. I'm talking about the assemblers and the deployers of different types of knowledge to intervene in human societies. So people who take different aspects of that knowledge and deploy it. And for me then, in this context, what I mean by expertise is a discourse which claims authority to govern and transform the conduct of human populations on the basis of producing a particular type of generalizable, depersonalized knowledge. Because in our society today, perhaps the most potent claim to authority is a claim to expertise or to knowledge. The other source of authority claims is that mentioned by Rachel or discussed by her in her proposal, which is to speak for the people. But the other, aside from speaking for the people, the most powerful claim to authority is expertise. And it's made even more potent by being disguised under a facade of objectivity, which elevates the expert above democratic contention and scrutiny. And I think then the context of the last decade is significant in terms of the centrality today of expertise as a claim to authority. That context is, on the one hand, the background of globalization that has separated both governments and elites from the populations that they supposedly represent or should govern, the massively growing inequality in the world, and the various populist revolts of both the left and the right against that. On the one hand, movements like the like the Occupy protests or the Indignacios in Spain, or the rise and fall of something like Syriza in Greece. On the other, the right-wing populist forces, the Trumps, the Brexiteers, and so forth. And in a certain way, I think the emphasis on expertise is a means for elites and people in power to push back against populist discontent. So one thing that has interested me is expertise as a technique of power. And the other is in the way in which the particular form of knowledge or type of knowledge embedded in expertise ties in to wider processes in our society. So the affinity between expertise as a particular type of knowledge, the fact it's depersonalized, context-free, generalizing, external, and so forth, and the intensification of a particular type of social order in our world today. That's one in which individuals are lifted out of local contexts, and through digitalization, globalization, and so on, we're inserted more and more into fluid networks of relations. And we need to adapt ourselves to those on an ongoing basis. We're all, in a way, entirely substitutable and replicable. And simultaneously, the thickening and growth of a new type of reality, a secondary reality imposed on our primary reality of concrete places and relationships, one which is mediatized, but also increasingly abstract and so forth. So how expertise as a particular type of knowledge and approach to the world ties in with these other processes. So what I want to do is defamiliarize expertise to a degree, because if you open a newspaper or look on a news site, in any given day, you'll be bombarded with different reports by different groups of experts on every topic under the sun. And we're all habituated to listening to this and to taking it at face value. In reality, I think there's something quite strange, quite unusual from a broad anthropological and historical viewpoint about contemporary expertise. And I think if we look across societies, there's at least three types of what I term fairly ordinary, normal knowledge we can identify. One is the very everyday, largely tacit knowledge of how the society we live in and the immediate physical environment work. So what Sumner called the folkways and the mores, things like knowing how to take your turn in conversation, knowing the rules of gift exchange in your particular community, what kind of greetings are used, how do you show respect to elders, and so on. Another is knowledge of particular skills, so a practical capacity in a craft or a technical discipline. How do you shoe a horse? How do you make a table? Or in modern societies, how do you prepare an aircraft for flight? And this is certainly specialized. It's the property of peculiar groups of people, but it's not theoretical, and it doesn't claim to govern the conduct of a population. It's concerned with very specific operations on our material surroundings. And the third type of, perhaps every day is the wrong word here, but the third type of knowledge that we find across pretty much all societies is wisdom. Not something we particularly recognize in our own society, but most societies have recognized certain people as wise. These are people who know how to live the good life, and they've gained that through a lifetime of experience and reflection on it, often informed by the spiritual traditions of their society. And again, this is very different from expertise because it's a matter of lived experience rather than following procedures. Now, all those types of what I'm calling ordinary knowledge are characterized by participation in the sense used by Levi-Bruhl, an intense involvement in their surroundings, in other people, in the community, in the physical environment around one. And as he describes it in the notebooks on primitive mentalities, Levi-Bruhl outlines participation as something that implies a fundamental unity of experience. And we can see that in all these types of everyday knowledge. If we think of what do people mean by wisdom in any society, it's a profound transformation of the self through experience and reflection. Likewise, tacit everyday knowledge is usually bound up with one's identity as a member of a particular community living in a particular place. A lot of specialized skills, if you think of driving a car, playing a sport, it's a matter of bodily memory and instinct as much as conscious thought. Expertise, on the other hand, is founded on the dissolution of participation. Expertise always has a method. It foregrounds methods and methodologies for gaining and organizing knowledge. And this will usually foreground separation of knowledge from the personality of the expert. So things like neutrality and objectivity. It will also foreground separation of knowledge from the social and physical context. Things like generalizability, replicability, universalism, abstraction. So expertise is characterized by the dissolution of participation and the adoption of an outsider perspective on both one's society and the world. Furthermore, it stakes its claim to authority on its separation from context. It claims to propound generalizable rules that are universal in scope and transcend particular contexts. And usually expert claims, even within the social world, are modeled on the hard sciences. The problem with that is that human action is immensely more context-bound than natural processes because it's inherently meaningful and historical. And if you strip away context and you try and talk about human action and social action purely in terms of generalities, the more you do that, the more meaningless it becomes. Another thing about most forms of knowledge is that they have a processual quality. Gaining any knowledge, discovering any knowledge involves a passage through some kind of experience. But in most of what I'm terming the ordinary forms of knowledge that I've looked at, that passage gives way to the post-liminal stage of integration, where somebody has come through, they've discovered something, they've learned something, and now they're integrating it within a new and relatively stable identity and social role. Expertise, on the other hand, involves an ongoing liminalization of knowledge and society. And I'll touch in a moment on things like the problematization of everything in expertise, the obsession with the future, with the risk. All of these contribute to its liminal character. But one that particularly strikes me is that to adopt the lessons or the teachings of expertise is to adopt an outsider view on the world. So not merely does the expert stand outside the world, they impose this on others. And the example from the pandemic is this poster that is everywhere across the UK, central to government's messaging: act like you've got it. So coronavirus, act like you've got it. And it's interesting to think for a moment about what's going on here, because you might have very good reasons to think you don't have coronavirus. You might have had it already. You might be vaccinated. You might have been inside for the last 3 months or whatever. Now, from the position of an expert looking at the population from outside as an equal mass of numerical units, this kind of messaging makes perfect sense, because statistically speaking, anybody has, a particular chance of getting the virus. The fewer that do so and pass it on, the lower the R rate will be. And so this kind of messaging makes complete sense. But from the particular perspective of a concrete individual in their own life world, what this is telling you is ignore your own knowledge of your own circumstances. Act as if you are indeed nothing more than a statistical unit. Suspend your ordinary life. Step back, critically examine every single thing that you're doing, and take on board this exterior, universalist, generalized perspective instead of your own particular personal perspective on your own life. So, you know, this isn't just in the case of coronavirus. This is a general characteristic of how expertise works in relation to society. It's a couple.
If you could reach a conclusion within a minute or so, perhaps.
Okay, so I'll just very quickly go through, Marius, some of these points without elaborating on much. So, okay. As a discourse, it's orientated towards limiting and controlling future risks. Any study that involves expertise is usually focused on some future risks. Through that, there's a relentless problematization of every aspect of social and personal life. You can no longer take anything for granted. You know, what's the best way to raise a child? What should you eat? Should you drive a particular vehicle? Everything is open to questions and to problematization. It claims through this effort to control future risks to control the behavior of human populations. So the typical claim is, unless we do X, terrible things will happen, therefore you need to change your behavior. It's universalising and generalising. The social is a uniform field subject to standardised rules and interventions. Localised contexts are discarded. And it is an expansionist drive to claim ever more areas of human life and institute new administrative regulations. You never get an expert report saying there's no need to do anything or to give us no further resources. It's always, we need to expand the resources available to the expert group. We need to introduce more regulation, more controls. And it assumes the perfectibility of human life and society as an achievable and legitimate aim. So again, there's a kind of totalizing goal. Okay, I'll skip governmentality because everybody has read Foucault, they can make the links themselves. And I'll bring this to a conclusion. So I think these characteristics of expertise have two consequences. First of all, things like the dissolution of participation, the separation from context, the liminalization of social life, which is also its atomization. Because expertise promotes these, it is the perfect tool for a particular type of power, which involves lifting people out of our local contexts to integrate them into flexible global networks. And Lewis Mumford wrote that the first technology was the mega machine, a machine in the first civilizations made out of human bodies and human individuals subject to central control. I think digitalization in particular is producing a type of new mega machine. And secondly, expertise distances us from the primary reality of our concrete physical surroundings and face-to-face relationships with concrete individuals. And it generates a kind of a mirror maze of abstract and general concepts, theories, decontextualized data. So, you know, we talk about being in the information age, that there's more information generated in the last, I don't know, is it 3 or 4 years than in the rest of human history. This is obviously nonsense. It's meaningless, decontextualized data, not real knowledge. And therefore, in both these regards, I think expertise is central to the construction of a second reality that we increasingly inhabit. And I'm quoting from Arpad's forthcoming keynote in terms of what that is, the unreal reality of the modern economy technology complex, where the entities are not only interconnected, but replaceable and parasitic on the surrounding world, which they increasingly suffocate, producing irreplaceable damage. So I think what the pandemic kind of does is it brings into focus a particular type of knowledge and a particular type of power, which has deep genealogical roots, which is reaching its apotheosis today and integrating us into a globalized second reality, which very much, I believe, strips us of our agency and even our humanity. Okay, thank you, Marius. So that's me concluded.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this very interesting talk. I was wondering whether we are still experts in anything after this talk. So we have two discussants on this paper, Professor Szakolczai and Arvidas. Professor?
Thank you very much, Marius. Yes, just very quickly, because we have to be careful about timing, and of course, because we have a tight schedule, and I think that the main point of your paper, and which I want to relate to it, rather than asking a question, is and to undermine its significance. That one of the standard buzzwords is that we are talking about a knowledge society. We are living in a knowledge society, and of course, expertise is just an element of that. And what is forgotten about in all of this talk about knowledge society is what is the meaning of knowledge. Now, we had actually a Socratic symposium and even a summer school, I think, about what is knowledge, and Plato's Status, and Plato's Status doesn't give a conclusive answer to that. So we don't know what knowledge is, and it makes a good progress towards sensitivizing or understanding that we cannot just talk about knowledge in that sense. So what are we talking about? Knowledge or wisdom or acquaintance or familiarity? And you singled out a number of different ways in which this question becomes problematic. So do we have data or do we have facts? Or when scientists talk about data, what they really mean is facts. And the big difference etymologically is a fact is something which is made. Fare, facere, data is what is given, data, and that's a huge difference. For example, in medieval theology, which of course nobody is interested in, there was a big discussion about, and that was a quite somewhat problematic discussion about the datum and donum. So is it something given as a datum, or is it something a donum as a gift? Now in English, given and the gift is almost the same etymologically. And of course, the present and the presence is a gift in other languages. What is given as a data. So what we mean by knowledge, and how can we problematize? And it's a very, very important issue, because now scientists and ecological disaster, and of course we need some kind of science, because what we mean by non-science is being enclosed in our media generated fake groups, this cultic knowledge which somebody mentioned in the panel before. Very cultic groups are a very, very important point. So of course, if we have cultic groups who are just media driven and read the news and tea parties and all this nonsense, then we are back to science. But again, we are in the various layers of unreality. So really, what is knowledge? What is wisdom? And just 2 points I want to mention now, which you partly mentioned, but give more importance. One is recognition. You mentioned recognition in connection to participation, but recognition is an extremely important word. Alessandro Pisorno wrote very important articles about recognition. Again, the cognitive term, we are talking about cognitivity. But I would emphasize recognitivity, and that's a huge issue of whether are we talking about knowledge in terms of cognition, knowledge, or recognition. And recognition means a kind of wisdom to understand what one is talking about and what are the consequences. And that's a huge kind of lackmus test, if you want, because many experts and scientists have a great deal of cognitive knowledge, but they don't have any recognitive knowledge because they don't understand what is the meaning of their acts or something like that. This is the fundamental issue. And the second is decontextualization. And that takes us into the heart of the virus and vaccination and so on, because the basis of Paul Rabinov wrote a book which I wanted to talk about in my, but I will not have time. Didn't have time to write on the development of this PCR. And it was based on, and the Nobel Prize was given on decontextualized knowledge. Very important. But decontextualized DNA, but what does it mean? That you take up a piece of a living organism and you decontextualize it. So you treat it as if it were not living, and then you get great scientific discoveries and so on. And this is then when you move into artificial intelligence and all these kind of things, which is a level up from genetical engineering. So our kind of experts and their universalistic knowledge, and again, what is universalistic? Because, what universalistic knowledge means, and again, it's a very important issue, that it doesn't matter who we are, humans. And now we are talking about posthumanism and transhumanism, and there is no limit to madness in this expert kind of knowledge. So who cares about whether it's living or not living? It's universalistic knowledge, and this is it's getting close to Dr. Mengele will once be recognized as or acknowledged as a great eugenic science or something like that. Or are we back to, or are we so different from Dr. Mengele? Do we still know that? But anyway, thank you.
Would you like to answer now, Paul, or just hear all the discussions?
I think I agree with all Arpad's points. I mean, the only thing I'd say is I think one of the things here that's crucial is I'm trying to do is walk a fairly thin line. We need to be able to recognize the unreality that surrounds us without giving up on the idea of our reality and falling into just postmodernist nonsensical stew. And I think some of the points Arpad made then about recognition and cognition and decontextualization, contextualization, speak directly to how we can do that. But I mean, I said in the paper itself, when I'm talking about experts as a problem, I'm not really talking about the guys up in Greenland, digging into ice cores to, identify the pace of climate change or so on. Science as well isn't one singular thing that we talk about. There's different modalities of science, some problematic, some essential.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So 2 more discussions, Harald and Arvidas. Harald or Arvidas?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this fascinating paper, which I read with great interest, and I learned a lot from it. My comments, I mean, Arpad has, of course, anticipated quite a bit already. So I would like to focus on 2 things just briefly. And that is, in a way, to perhaps from that perspective, it's even scarier. Max Weber wrote in his Science as a Vocation that the primitive, the savage, is less ignorant of his tools and of the technology of his tools than we are. So basically, I mean, Max Weber wrote in 1919, right? So he gives an example of how the tram works, or like train coaches work. But of course, we are infinitely much further. The point is that he says that we compensate our ignorance with our unconditional belief in division of labor, right? And the possibility that if we have to, we can look up, how things work. Okay, I think I would add to that, Weber doesn't talk about it, I would add the other aspect to it. There is a hope. There is a hope for the betterment of life. I mean, I could start with very easy things like the dishwasher or the washing machine. Who could think a life for us without that? And who knows really how it works, right? So there are, of course, if you take it further, there is many issues attached. I have the right to choose what kind of hair color or eye color my child will have, and we have now the technologies, and there are people who basically can implant that and make that happen. So there is this whole issue about life, about rights, about the betterment of life. So I'm not to talk about the nanotechnologies and the small dust we can now implant into people's bodies. So I buy everything you say, and you outlined it marvelously well and very nicely. The problem is, I think that we are, and our generation, and even the generation before us, and the young generation that is coming up even more, have been, I wouldn't say trained, just basically it is in our first-hand experience, practice, and our taking part and taking for granted in the world, that there is a level which we just don't understand. So we defer to scientists. Now we defer to scientists, and of course there are different levels to it. But I think there is not only the type of dimension that you outlined so very nicely, the accumulated, decontextualized, non-participant form of a power influencing or shaping group of experts who float around, but there is an extremely immense demand from us, and a kind of almost not only ignorance, kind of like a powerlessness, that we stand before this ever accumulating technological avalanche that comes from all science. Arpad mentioned gene therapy, artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnologies. So we all, I mean, even the greatest experts, they're only experts in their little bit. So That's one thing. So it's basically the bottom up perspective of what we have been trained into in the last 100, 150 years. And I completely agree that the pandemic is sort of like a climax. But my second point, that's probably shorter now, is I would like to challenge, or to ask, basically, to wonder about, is it really those who hold the expertise? Is it the scientists? I mean, you gave wonderful evidence, you know, follow the scientist and everything. But I would like to evoke something that Aldous Huxley wrote in 1947. He wrote this little play, Ape and Essence, which is not very well known. And that starts with a vignette. And the vignette is about the two opposing sides having a little kind of chimpanzee type, little Einstein on a leash, both of them, who then pushes the bottom, right? That will sort of like make the nuclear weapons explode. So basically here, the scientists who developed the nuclear bomb, right? They did science, but they were working towards something they hoped, you know, could end this terrible political thing, that this terrible kind of, fascist takeover of the world. So my question is, do you think that within this group of scientists, these experts who float above our heads and have a huge power over politicians, do you think that after all there are dividing lines that actually make these scientists do, after all, or stick to political dividing lines? So, I mean, Huxley's point was that after all, political fault lines will always instrumentalize scientists, and they will sort of like execute those needs and necessities that political conflicts and struggle, demand. And I wonder whether you have thought about it, or whether you would have a view on whether that would be fitting to the current pandemic, because so far what you presented, and I said, and extremely thoroughly, it seems as if there was a kind of conspiracy of this unreality that these experts sort of like were mounting. So that was just as a question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Harold. There's a huge amount there, and I'll try and respond to it, but obviously in terms of time, because I could probably go on for about an hour. First of all, I love the quote from Weber, and if you could actually let me know where that quote is. It's actually something I could use in a future rendition.
It's in Science as a Vocation. It's the essay Science as a Vocation, 1990.
Yes, of course. So I think that quote gets to the core of a dilemma we have at the moment. And it's a dilemma that manifests itself in, say, the rise of conspiracy theories, the whole idea of fake news and so on. People up to a generation ago in some countries, a couple of generations ago in others, the knowledge that they needed every day, and even the term knowledge, as Arpad said, is problematic, but they had a really good grasp of their physical environment, how it worked, what was around them, plants, food, animals, and so on. They had a really good grasp of the social relationships that mattered. So here in Bedouin society up to 2 generations ago, every granny knew literally the descent of every family and neighboring tribe and their rulers for 100 years back. And this was the knowledge you used to set up a marriage between your daughter and a suitable partner. And they had practical skills to manage their environment. We've lost most of that. What does that leave us? On the one hand, of course, we can Google practically everything, but knowledge is mediated. It's mediated through technology. It's also mediated through these people and experts, and also through institutions. But because it's not direct and concrete, it can then, it's open to question, it's problematized, and it's also open to manipulation. And I think the more the world is digitalized, mediatized, globalized, the more that intensifies. And we're possibly at an inflection point. And I agree with you on the one hand, there is this trust and this demand for expertise, but you also see this rising paranoia and sense we're not in control, and the people who are in control, not that anybody is necessarily completely in control, but they don't have our best interests at heart. There's also a deliberate generation of helplessness. So if you think the way car engines have evolved, 30 years ago, any mechanic or even someone with basic mechanical skills could fix their car. Now the parts are black boxes that have to be ordered from a motor company. Something similar is happening with phones and electronic devices. There's controversy in America at the moment. Apple is deliberately making sure that independent technicians can't fix Apple devices. So there's this deliberate disempowerment. And as I say, I think as things become more centralized and digitalized and globalized, that is reaching an inflection point where the sense of hope becomes lost, and what's left is the paranoia and fear. Your question about, is it the experts or is it someone else? I think it's a layered answer. On the one hand, it is absolutely without question. It suits the politicians to put forward an Anthony Fauci or, what is it, the sage that they have in the UK or the similar in Ireland, and they can take the flak and the politicians put up their hands. And it's similarly, for the same reason, it suits the politicians for the last 30 years to make central banks independent, to sign over a whole lot of things to experts. And then when there's criticism, they don't have to take the blame. I think if you look at, say, the likes of Alvin Goldner, writing 20, 30, 40 years ago about the rise of the technical managerial elite, other writing about the rise of the new class, and so on. There is also a fact that the dominant group in society today is increasingly people with a particular kind of technical managerial knowledge, and they have an affinity with that knowledge and with others who purvey it. So that's also an element of what's going on here. Out of that as well, I mean, who have been the big beneficiaries over the last year with the pandemic and the lockdowns? It is the tech corporations. So, and also the industrial medical pharmaceutical complex. So particular power groups that are related by culture and expertise to individual experts, and then political elites stepping back.
Can we make it a bit shorter? Yeah. Oh, sorry for interrupting.
No, but I suppose I could go on forever, but that's the core of what I'd say.
Yes. Thank you very much, Paul. We are a bit behind the schedule. Arvidas, so perhaps you want quick?
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to make it really quick, but thank you, Paul, for a very interesting paper. And I find it very valuable is because it provides a critique that can be an alternative to another very dangerous discourse and critical of this expert scientific discourse, the dilettantistic, I don't know, conspiracy theory based and that kind of absolute rejection of scientific knowledge as another way of challenging the power of experts. But I mean, what you're doing is I will be talking about that more about in my own talk. But what you're doing is, I think you're giving a third way out of it, because the way I see it, we're in a situation where this managerial expert-based power structure is trying to manage us and the pandemic, and then you have an opposition of whatever populist means, but this kind of mythological or symbolic based, bullshit culture. Basically, that is trying to oppose that kind of management, which is a dangerous situation because neither of them is perfect in a sense. So that's one idea, and I just thought that what could really be useful. I really enjoyed the division of forms of knowledge that you provided, and I think what could do what could help is also giving perhaps an example of each of these forms of knowledge as venues for just imagination as to how would a pandemic managed by a different form of knowledge could look like, and that's also a question. Would you imagine another way of dealing with it?
Is there a quick answer, Paul, for this?
Well, to the first question, I think I agree with what you're saying. I mean, as I said already, in terms of RPAS comments, we can't give up on the idea of reality. And I think the condition of the world is too serious for that. So if you have someone like Baudrillard and postmodernism, coming from a very more comfortable phase of modernity where, okay, give up on this idea of reality and we'll all just play. Reality is dead and what's left is play. Well, things like the ecological crisis are too serious. So it's a means of teasing out different forms of knowledge. And there's many different forms of knowledge, even in modern society, never mind when we look at other civilizations through time, and trying to form a conceptual way, using concepts like participation and liminality to diagnose those that are problematic or have potential. In terms of recommendations around the pandemic, I mean, if we open that conversation, I think it would go on forever. I do think if more autonomy had been given to localized authorities, communities, and also trust people. Nobody wants to catch the disease. I mean, actually have a bit of trust in people in their ordinary lives to take precautions within their ordinary circumstances. But I say that would open up another eternal conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul.